He came for a horse, but instead found a woman staring straight into his soul. "Don't buy the horse," she whispered, her voice trembling like the last leaf in a prairie wind. "Take me home, and I'll be yours always." The midday sun in Dry Creek, Wyoming, blazed down on the corral. The smell of dust, horse sweat, and leather filled the air. Cowboys leaned on the rails, calling out bids in sharp bursts. The auctioneer's voice rolled like a drumbeat, hammering the rhythm of a deal about to be made. But for him, Clint McAllister, a man who'd spent years chasing cattle, dodging bullets, and burying too many friends, everything in that moment slowed. He saw her through the shimmering heat. A young woman in a faded calico dress, her hair wind-blown, eyes locked on him with something between desperation and defiance. The crowd's noise faded to a dull roar in his ears. All he heard was her plea. "You're not from around here," he finally said, his voice low, carrying the gravel of a man who'd ridden too many miles alone. "No," she replied, glancing over her shoulder as if shadows followed her. "And I don't have much time to explain." A ripple of unease slid down Clint's spine. This wasn't just a woman asking for a favor. It was a woman running from something. The auctioneer called Clint's name, expecting a bid. The chestnut mare in the pen pawed the ground, restless. Clint's hand hovered over his belt buckle, torn between the life he'd come to live and the one suddenly staring him in the face. Around them, the air seemed to tighten. A pair of men in black dusters stood near the hitching post, watching too closely. One of them lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a warning signal. Clint met her eyes again. "What happens if I say yes?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you'll have to ride faster than you've ever ridden in your life." A distant roll of thunder cracked over the mountains, though the sky was clear. Somewhere deep inside, Clint knew he wasn't about to buy a horse. He was about to buy trouble. And yet, trouble had a way of finding him. And this time, it wore a calico dress. October 1887. Dry Willow sat like a stubborn knot of wood in the middle of the New Mexico territory, its weathered buildings leaning into the wind, as if bracing for something it knew was coming. Beyond the auction yard, the land stretched out in every direction, dry creek beds clawing through red earth, clusters of sagebrush clinging to life, and the distant teeth of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains biting into the horizon. The air carried a taste of wood smoke and anticipation, the kind that sits heavy in a town where everyone knows each other's business, but still pretends not to. The yard itself was alive in its own quiet way. Lanterns burned low, their flames pulling at the night as though reluctant to stay lit. A few townsfolk leaned against the fence rails, hats pulled low, boots planted in the dirt that had been churned soft by hooves. They weren't here to buy. They were here to see something happen, the way buzzards circle before they know for sure there's meat to be had. Cole Haverford was one of the few who didn't seem restless. Broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and carrying the kind of stillness that only comes from years of riding the open range. He stood with one boot hooked on the bottom rail, his eyes fixed on the stallion in the corral. Shadowrunner, coal-black and scarred from past scrapes, had the look of an animal that had never once in its life surrendered to a man's will. Cole liked that in a horse. The girl, Marietta Two Rivers, stood no more than 10 feet away from him, though the space between them felt like a canyon. She wore a faded calico dress patched at the hem, and a strip of Navajo weaving wrapped around her waist like a belt, the pattern a deep red against black, each line telling a story to those who could read it. Her bare feet were dusted white from the chalky earth. Even from here, Cole could see the defiance in her jaw, the unspoken challenge in her posture. Behind her, Elias Crow loomed with the easy arrogance of a man who thought the whole scene belonged to him. He was dressed cleaner than most, broadcloth vest, polished boots, but there was a slickness in his eyes that made folks keep a hand near their sidearm when he was around. His business was horses, but no one in Dry Willow was fool enough to believe that's all he traded in. Sam Whitlock, the town's mail carrier and sometimes reluctant witness to trouble, lingered in the background. He delivered enough letters marked urgent to know the kind of deals that left scars on a place. From where he stood, he could see everything: the tension in Cole's shoulders, the tightening of Marietta's hands at her sides, the twitch of Crow's smile. The auctioneer was stalling, talking about bloodlines and stamina, though everyone could see the way the night was veering off script. Shadowrunner tossed his head and stamped, drawing murmurs from the men at the rail. Cole's eyes shifted from the horse to the girl, weighing something, unspoken. That was when Marietta spoke again, her voice lower this time, as if meant only for him. "If you ride away tonight, I'll be gone by morning." The words carried the finality of a closing gate, one you either passed through or stayed behind. Cole didn't answer her, not yet. He studied her the way he might study a strange trail in the sand, one that could lead to water or an ambush. Finally, he asked, his voice slow, deliberate, with the dust of the plains in it. "What makes you think I'm the kind of man who rides toward trouble instead of away from it?" Her reply was as steady as the way she stood, bare feet in the dust. "Because you're still here." The words settled into the crowd like a thrown stone in a still pond. Men shifted their weight, boots scuffing the dirt. A few tried to hide the way their eyes darted between the two. Crow's smirk faded just enough to show he'd heard it too. Somewhere behind them, a small fire crackled near a vendor's cart, the smell of food curling into the cool night. A man from the Navajo camp had brought in a clay pot earlier, and now the rich scent of mutton stew simmered with corn, wild onions, and juniper berries drifted over the yard. It was the kind of meal meant to be eaten slowly, shared under the stars, but tonight it felt out of place, too warm, too communal, against the chill of what was unfolding here. Cole glanced once toward the cart, then back to Marietta. "Where do you belong, girl?" he asked, the question more knife than curiosity. She lifted her chin toward the dark line of hills beyond the town. "With the people who remember my name, not the ones who try to sell it." For a long moment, the only sound was the restless shifting of Shadowrunner in the corral, the leather creak of tack, the soft chink of spurs as Cole straightened from the rail. Around them, the townsfolk leaned in without meaning to, their breaths caught halfway. Cole didn't smile, didn't frown, just took a step forward, the dust rising around his boots. The night seemed to tighten, pulling everyone closer to the edge of something they didn't yet understand, but knew would matter before the sun came up. And above it all, the smell of mutton stew clung to the air, a reminder that somewhere, beyond this tangle of men, horses, and choices, life still offered warmth, if you were willing to fight for it. The wind shifted, dragging in a sharper chill from the north, the kind that slips under collars and sets the skin prickling. The auction yard, moments ago a murmur of casual interest, had turned into a knot of taut silence. Shadowrunner's hooves thudded once against the packed earth, sending a shiver through the fence rails. Cole's eyes stayed on Marietta, but something in his posture said he was measuring more than just the truth in her words. He was measuring the cost. Elias Crow saw it too. He stepped closer to her, his shadow swallowing hers in the dust. "She's here because she owes," he said loudly enough for the men at the rail to hear. "Her father took my silver, my feed, and my horseflesh. When he couldn't pay, he sent me his daughter. Fair trade." The crowd reacted in shifting glances, some with hard eyes, others with uneasy gulps. In Dry Willow, debts were settled in ways that weren't written down. It was one of the reasons the town survived, and one of the reasons it could rot from the inside. Marietta's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Her gaze stayed on Cole, not on Crow. That, more than anything, seemed to ignite the tension in the air. Crow's voice took on a mocking edge. "Tell me, Cole, if a man takes what's owed to him, is that theft or justice?" It was the kind of question that could split a room, the kind that forced men to declare what they believed about the law when the law was standing on both sides of the line. From my place at the hitching post, I could see it ripple through the onlookers. One man muttered, "Debt's debt." Another shot back, "She ain't cattle." A third just spat in the dirt and kept his mouth shut. Cole finally spoke, his voice like a slow draw from a well, deep, deliberate, unshakable. "Justice isn't decided by who shouts loudest in a yard, Elias." Crow smiled thinly. "No, it's decided by who's left standing when it's over." The two men locked eyes, and the space between them became something alive, hot, dangerous, coiled like a rattlesnake in the grass. Marietta broke the stare, stepping forward half a pace, enough to make the two men's shadows overlap. "My father's debt was his choice," she said quietly, but her voice carried. "Selling me was yours." Her words landed like a hammer on glass. No shout, no scream, but something brittle broke all the same. Crow laughed, short and ugly. "And you think riding off with a stranger will change that? Or is he just another buyer?" The crowd murmured again, this time sharper. I saw a young ranch hand's brow furrow, as if the thought had found a crack to wedge into. Was Cole rescuing her, or just making a cleaner purchase? Cole's hand flexed at his side. The question hung in the air, like the smell of rain before a storm. This was the fracture, the moment when doubt seeped in, when men who'd been leaning one way suddenly shifted their weight back toward the fence. The voice, from the far side of the yard, called out, "What's the difference, Haverford?" "You pay, you take her home. Sounds the same to me." Cole turned slightly, enough so his eyes swept the faces in the crowd. His tone stayed even. "The difference is what happens after the gate closes." It didn't erase the doubt. If anything, it made the division sharper. Between those who believed him, those who didn't, and those who didn't care, so long as there was something to talk about in the saloon later. Shadowrunner tossed his head again, snorting hard. The stallion's restlessness seemed to mirror the mood, the way the yard's energy kept circling back to the same question no one wanted to answer outright. Was this about saving someone, or about owning them? Crow stepped back, letting the question fester. He didn't need to win the crowd outright. He just needed to make them uncertain enough to weaken Cole's standing. That was how men like him operated. The Navajo stew's scent drifted back into the air as someone ladled it into a wooden bowl nearby. The smell, rich with mutton, corn, and juniper, was almost obscene against the sharpness of the exchange. It belonged to a world where people sat together and shared, not where they picked sides in the dust. Marietta's eyes softened for a moment as the scent reached her. It was the food of her people, the kind made for gatherings under a sky full of stars, for stories told with laughter and hands gesturing in the firelight. Here, it smelled like a memory she wasn't sure she'd ever touch again. Cole saw that flicker in her face, and something in him shifted. He stepped away from the fence, closing the space between them until the smell of leather and horse and the faint smoke of his coat met her. Crow didn't move, but his smirk deepened. He'd planted the seed. Now he wanted to see if it would grow in the dark. The silence stretched long enough that even the horses in the corral seemed to wait. Somewhere down the street, a saloon piano stumbled over a chord and fell quiet. Cole broke the moment, not with a defense, but with a question that rolled low and quiet into the charged air. "Marietta, if I ride out of here with you, will you walk beside me? Or will you always be looking for the next man to take you further?" Her lips parted, but no sound came at first. The crowd leaned in, hungry for her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, stripped of anything but truth. "If I walk beside you, I walk all the way home." The words hung there, and I swear even the wind slowed to hear them. Whether they settled the matter or just shifted it into a new shape, no one could say. But it was enough to turn eyes back toward Crow, and in Dry Willow, that was dangerous for a man who thrived in the shadows. Crow's jaw tightened, just enough to show he knew the ground under him had moved, if only a little. But little shifts in the west could start landslides. And that night, standing in that yard, you could almost feel the rocks beginning to loosen. The auctioneer's voice faltered again, words trailing off into the kind of quiet that doesn't just happen. It's built piece by tension so thick you could drag a knife through it. Somewhere beyond the yard, the sound of the river, dry for most of the summer, whispered faintly under the stones, carrying the ghost of water that had once kept Dry Willow alive. The lantern swayed in the breeze, throwing shadows that twitched and stretched across the corral fence like restless spirits. Cole stood between two truths, one that could make him the man Marietta hoped he was, and one that could make him just another name in the saloon gossip by morning. He didn't flinch under the weight of it, but I could see the calculation in the set of his jaw. That was when Elias Crow moved, not a step, not even a hand gesture, just a shift in his smile, like a man about to play his winning card. "You know," Crow began, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the crowd. "There's a story about your Marietta here. Not the one she tells. Not the one you'd want to hear before you go throwing your silver away." The men nearest to him leaned in like hounds catching a new scent. Cole didn't speak, but the angle of his shoulders told me he was bracing for something. Crow took his time, savoring the silence, then dropped it like a hammer. "She wasn't just sent to me for her father's debt. She chose it." A ripple went through the crowd. Low whistles, muttered curses, a cough that didn't quite hide a laugh. Marietta's face didn't change, but the color in her cheeks deepened. Whether from shame or fury, it was impossible to tell. "She came to me," Crow continued, "in Tombstone 3 summers ago. Stood outside the Birdcage Theater, offered herself in trade for a roof and a place to keep her belly full. Said she was tired of sleeping in the red dust outside of Canyon de Chelly. I didn't seek her out, she came to me. Tombstone." The name carried weight in the West, not just for its gunfights and saloons, but for what it meant. A place where fortunes and lives were won and lost in the same breath, where truth was as slippery as a greased poker chip. The crowd reacted in layers, some with suspicion toward her, others with knowing nods that life in the territory left little room for purity of choice. But the damage was done. Doubt is a clever enemy. It doesn't have to be true, only possible. Marietta finally spoke, her voice steady but low, like a rider talking to a skittish horse. "I was 16. My mother had been buried 2 weeks. The cattle had been taken by rustlers. I hadn't eaten in days. And the man I asked for work told me there was only one kind I was fit for." She turned to the crowd, letting her gaze sweep over them. "If you've never been hungry enough to trade your name for bread, don't you dare call it a choice." It was the kind of statement that split a man clean in half. 1 part respect, 1 part unease. The murmurs shifted, the tide of opinion swinging but not yet settled. Cole stepped forward, closing the distance between him and Crow until their boots were nearly touching. "You left out the part where you kept her long after the debt was paid," he said. "Or did you call that interest?" Crow's eyes narrowed, but he kept the smirk. "Interest, Haverford, is what you'll be paying if you take her without my say." The moment teetered on the edge of breaking. Shadowrunner stamped and snorted, as though sensing the blood in the water. Somewhere in the crowd, A man's spur jingled as he shifted, the faint metallic chime cutting through the silence. And then the twist came, not from Crow, not from Marietta, but from the far side of the yard. A voice, old and worn like sun-bleached leather, called out, "That's a lie, Elias." And you know it. Heads turned to see Sheriff Amos Caldwell, broad in the shoulders despite his years, pushing his way through the crowd. He wore the dust of the trail on his coat and the weariness of the law in his eyes. "I was in Tombstone that summer," the sheriff said. "I remember a girl with Navajo braids and a look in her eye that could cut through a poker table. She was working at the birdcage, all right, but she was working the kitchen, scrubbing pots so black you couldn't tell the soot from the metal. You didn't own her, Crow, you hired her. And when she asked for her wages, you told her the pay was protection from the men in the back rooms." A collective murmur rose, heavier now, the weight of it pressing in on Crow. He tried to speak, but Caldwell's voice rolled over him like a thunderhead. "She left town because she heard you'd made a deal to sell her to a mining camp foreman in Bisbee. That's the truth of it." The twist hit hard. It didn't just put Crow on the defensive. It cracked the shape of the whole story he'd built. Crow's smirk slipped, just for a breath, before he masked it with a laugh. "Sheriff, you've got a long memory for someone who spends most of his time polishing a badge in a town this small." "Small towns remember best," Caldwell said simply. For the first time since the night began, the crowd's murmur turned toward agreement. Not the half-hearted kind, but the kind that makes men shift closer to the one speaking. Crow had lost the easy hold he had on them. Marietta's eyes found Cole's again. This time, there was something else there. Not just the plea for rescue, but the raw edge of someone who just had a piece of their truth restored in front of strangers. Cole gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was the first step toward one. Crow knew he was losing the room, and like any man with too much pride and not enough conscience, he moved to force the ground back under his boots. "Fine," he said. "If you want her, Haverford, you can have her if... You can take Shadowrunner from me tonight." Bareback. Across the flats to the old mission outside Tombstone and back. Before first light, gasps and low whistles rippled through the crowd. The old mission was 20 miles of open desert each way, the kind of ride that could kill a man if the wind turned or the horse lost its footing in the dark. And doing it bareback, without saddle or bridle, was a dare bordering on madness. Cole didn't blink. "And if I make it?" "She's yours. No silver, no debt, clean." "And if I don't?" Crow's smile was all teeth. "You walk away without the horse, without the girl, and without a place in this town that'll serve you a drink." It wasn't just a wager. It was a public stripping of pride if Cole failed. In the West, a man could survive without a lot of things, but not without his name. The sheriff didn't step in. Maybe he knew this was a fight that couldn't be stopped by the law. Maybe he knew that, one way or another, it had to burn itself out in the open. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the scent of risk the way moths are drawn to a flame. Somewhere behind me, someone muttered, "He'll never make it past the flats. Not on that horse." Marietta didn't speak, but her hands clenched tighter around the strip of Navajo weaving at her waist. Her knuckles showed white in the lantern light. Cole finally broke the stillness with a single word. "Done." The deal was struck in the dust, under the swaying lanterns, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains watching from the distance like silent judges. And in that moment, Dry Willow wasn't just a town. It was an arena, and every man, woman, and beast in it knew that before the sun rose over Tombstone, something here would change for good. Midnight crept in like a careful thief, touching lantern glass and boot leather with a thin glaze of frost. The auction yard had thinned to a hard core of onlookers, men who could not sleep when honor was on the line, and women who knew honor alone never kept a man alive. I stayed too, a mail sack for a pillow and a coil of worry knotted tight behind my ribs. The sheriff lingered in the dark like a boundary stone. Elias Crow glinted where the light found him, a sliver of knife that had learned to smile. Cole Haverford didn't talk. He moved. That was how you learned the measure of him. By the way his hands did the thinking. He stripped Shadowrunner to the raw. No saddle, no blanket, no bit, no bridle. A single braided rawhide neck rope lay coiled over his palm, more promise than tack. The stallion trembled, not from fear, but from memory, the kind that seizes muscle before a mind can name it. Steam feathered from his nostrils. He pawed once, twice, then held. Marietta stepped close enough for the horse to feel her breath. She did not touch him, just stood in the cold, with her hands at her sides, the strip of Navajo weaving at her waist, drinking lantern light. From the Navajo camp beyond the freight road, someone had brought a small clay bundle wrapped in rough cloth. She untied it and revealed a round of ash bread, blue corn kneaded with juniper ash, baked hard as discipline. She broke it, offered half to Cole and half to the night, the way you do when you ask the world to give a man back in one piece. Cole took his piece without ceremony. He ate slow, eyes on the horse, jaw working methodically like a clock that refused to hurry. Marietta held the other half in her palm until her fingers went white, then tucked it into the pocket of her calico dress, as if saving a word she wasn't ready to speak. Caldwell lifted a hand for quiet. His voice was flat iron, no theatrics, just terms hammered true. Bareback, no bridle. From here to the old mission on San Pedro and back, before first light clears the top of the OK Corral's roofline. No one rides after him. No one rides to meet him. Any man who breaks that will answer to me. Crow's grin stayed put, but his eyes shifted like cards under a gambler's thumbs. The flats will do the choosing, he said. They always do. Cole slid the neck rope over Shadowrunner's massive throat and stood at the left shoulder until the stallion's ears softened. He breathed deep, twice, slow pulls from the bottom of him, then vaulted up in a single clean arc, legs folding the horse like a sprung trap. Shadowrunner crow-hopped once, testing, then surged forward to the rail with a grinding boom of hooves. Cole melted with him, loose in the waist, tight in the knees, hands open on the black glass of his mane. The gate swung. Noise fell away behind the first pounding strides. I watched them cut the yard in two and break into the street, a shiver of shadow against the plank fronts, past the dark window of the rusty lantern and the sleeping forge, under the dangling sign of the mercantile, where rope, coffee, flour, and the cheapest kind of hope were sold by the pound. A single dog threw itself hoarse at the night, then thought better of it and hid. Marietta did not follow. She pivoted to face Crow. No words, just a steady, open stare, the kind you lay over a rattlesnake because turning your back is how you get bit. Crow smirked as if the staring were a truce he'd invented. Caldwell drifted a step between them and let the badge take up space where a gun did not need to. I left the rail and moved as far as the end of town, to where the packed street sloughed off into the Thorn and Alkali. From there, I could keep my eyes on the desert's mouth and still make it back if the night began to spit men out of it. Out on the flats, the wind had changed its mind. It came now from the east, off the San Pedro, colder and cleaner, sharpening edges. Cole set Shadowrunner's rhythm at a ground-eating lope that measured the distance rather than smashed it. 3 beats and a reach, 3 beats and a reach, bones and tendon and will threading forward. Bareback, a man either learned humility quick or learned pain the slower way. Cole floated, weight in his thighs, breath riding the horse's breath. He was not trying to own the stallion. He was asking, again and again, with every stride. The desert answered the way deserts do, first with silence, then with tests that pretend to be accidents. A prairie owl lifted from a barrel cactus and stitched a white seam through the dark. A coyote trotted parallel for 20 yards, tail a rag of question, then vanished into mesquite. Somewhere behind, the flats exhaled a dust devil that went nowhere and shredded itself without meaning. Then the first sign came, the kind that only shows itself to a man who has ridden enough to read, and to a man on foot who has delivered letters through bad country long enough to learn the handwriting of sabotage. Out beyond the last mesquite, where the cattle path narrowed between two dry arroyos, a thin line of new wire stretched low across the ground, ankle height to a man afoot, cannonball for a horse at speed. Moonlight found the barbs and put 4 cold stars on them. Cole saw it light, because that is how wire is made to be seen, and asked Shadow Runner for air. The stallion answered with a coiled leap that cleared iron by the thickness of a knuckle. The wire sang, a cheap, bright sound that made my stomach turn. Cole landed forward, hips driving down, hands still wide, the whole shape of him an apology for asking too much and a prayer for being answered. Shadowrunner shook his head once as if to insult the trap, then lengthened his stride. Back in the dark behind me, a figure uncorked itself from shadow and slid deeper into it. The sheriff's star winked once like a bad omen and then quieted. Caldwell did not move. He did not have to. His kind of law was old. He took names the way stone takes footprints, slow but permanent. Cole put the wire behind him and let the stallion cruise. Bare ground grew into rippling skin under moonlight, a muscle laid open by wind and time. The flats were not empty. They were crowded with absence, the bare memory of water, the ghost of buffalo, the old songs of people who walked before horses came. Shadowrunner found a second gear that was not faster so much as more certain. At the first arroyo, Cole slid him to a side hill, followed a game trail through catclaw and greasewood, then cut back to the floor where the wash had packed tight enough to take weight. He dismounted long enough to check hooves by feel, frog, wall, sole, no stone lodged, no heat. When he swung up again, the stallion huffed once in complaint and then accepted the man as a part of his spine. On the far lip of the arroyo, the flats opened clean to the San Pedro plain, and beyond that, if the night allowed, Tombstone's dark suggestion in the mission's low roofline where a bell once hung that could gather a town faster than a gunshot. The OK Corral lay to the west of that, an idea in the dark, more than a thing you could touch, but ideas carry weight out here, and men reckon with them all the same. The second sign came without sound, which is how bad things prefer to arrive. 2 riders lifted out of the low country, like they'd been planted and watered there. Mesquite men, lean and jointed, their hats pulled down, their horses standing too quiet for honest stock. They did not move to intercept. They paced, equidistant, as if measuring, as if waiting for a word that had not yet been said. Cole did not break stride. He gathered Shadowrunner's neck rope in his left hand, not to drag the head down, just to remind the horse where the center lived, and let his right hand hover palm down over the curve of the withers, as if smoothing air. The stallion's ears ticked forward, back, forward again, setting a metronome for nerve. Cole angled a hair to the north, enough to force the men to choose whether to follow or to circle. They followed. I could not see their faces from where I stood, but I did not need faces to know a man's intent. The way they sat said everything, too still, too straight, like bullets that had added saddles as an afterthought. Caldwell's boots creaked in the dark behind me as he shifted. His voice did not raise, and he did not mean for most of us to hear it, but I did. I said no one rides after him. The night took the words and hid them under its coat. Cole let the rider's tail and bled speed to a trot so Shadowrunner could breathe long. He was not trying to outrun anything yet. He was trying to arrive with enough horse left to get home. When the trot settled, he cued a side pass with a knee, slid the stallion 3 paces left without losing forward drift, then put him back on line. It was a small thing, a sideways thought written on a long page, but it told the men behind him something. This animal could be steered with a whisper. The third sign announced itself with smell before shape. Creosote crushed fresh. Rope burned recently, sweat that wasn't horse. Cole lifted his chin and found it. A drag of brush half buried across the cattle path, tiresome more than deadly, but set where a horse would likely tangle at speed. He feathered Shadowrunner to a jog, hopped the mess as casually as stepping over a bootjack, and let the stallion stretch out again. Behind, one of the tail riders nudged his mount forward and then thought better of it. Patience can be a weapon. So can daylight. Crow had wagered on both. The San Pedro Plain gave itself grudgingly. The river whispered in reeds that had no business being that green in a place that understood thirst so well. Off to the right, something hunched that was either a saguaro or an old man deciding where to die. Overhead, stars spilled carelessly, the way a drunk loses coins, bright, numerous, and not missed until morning. Cole felt the stallion begin to roll under him, shoulders loosening, back swinging like a bell clapper, breath coming deep and regular. The first miles had pulled the fight into the open. Now the partnership set its teeth. He lowered his center until the horse could not tell where muscle ended and rider began. The neck rope draped without pressure. The cue lived in thigh and hip and the small bones of a man's back saying, yes, 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 when lesser men try to shout. At a shallow bend in the river, he let Shadowrunner drink, but only 3 swallows, the kind a medic would prescribe, not the kind a horse would choose. He scraped his hand over the stallion's ribs to feel for sweat and found what he wanted. Damp, not slick, warm, not hot. He put his ear to the shoulder for a beat and the world knocked in time. When they moved again, dawn was still a rumor, but the east had unfastened one small button. Far ahead, a low smear of darker dark suggested the mission's adobe walls squatting near the cottonwoods. Cole did not look at it. You do not stare at a finish you haven't earned. The riders behind drifted wider, widening like wolves learning a herd animal's shape. Cole angled toward a patch of flat stubbled with saccaton, wanting firm footing and no hidden holes. The stallion's stride ate ground like a story eats silence. Then the fourth sign, no longer a hint but a declaration, rose from the left in the form of a third horse and rider, this one coming not to pace but to cross the line. He carried no lantern, wore no badge. The horse beneath him was a good animal ridden badly, mouth braced, back dropped, flanks foamed with the blunt arithmetic of spurs. The man put himself where a collision would be honor's fault if anyone asked later. Cole did not check the stallion. He breathed once and traded speed for balance, letting the stride lift into a loftier canter that could pivot if it had to. Shadowrunner's ears pinned and then flattened forward, committing. The newcomer tilted his head, gauging nerve, and reached down, too slow, to the cinch that wasn't there on Cole's horse. No leather to grab, no horn to hook, no law to invent. They crossed at a bias, 2 lines that might have been friends in a world with different men, and missed by the width of a palm. Cole let his right knee kiss the intruder's stirrup to let him know the difference between luck and choice. The man flinched. Men who start fights with traps often end them with excuses. The mission grew into itself, low, square, scarred by weather and salvaged by stubbornness. Cole brought Shadowrunner around the cottonwoods instead of through them, keeping the horse's legs clean, and touched the cracked bell with his left hand as he passed the arch. The metal was cold and silent, but the gesture counted. In this country, you tally what you can, when you can. He did not stop. He carved a tight half circle around the dry cistern, let the stallion sit down on his hocks, and pivot like a door on a honed hinge, then faced the long black ribbon back to dry willow. Dawn had put a thin blade under the horizon. He would have to cut with it. On the turn, the two pacing riders closed like gate halves. Cole asked Shadowrunner for awake legs without panic, and the stallion gave him angles instead of speed, slipping through a triangle of space that existed because belief made it so. One man grabbed at air where a rein should have been. The other learned what a hind hoof says to a knee when it has the floor. He shouted. The flats put that sound away where it keeps fools' promises. For the first time, Cole spoke 2 words. They weren't meant for the horse or for the men or for me. They were for the dark that had carried him this far without breaking him. Hold steady. Shadowrunner did. He threaded the first half-mile home like he knew where every old bone lay under the crust. Behind, one rider wheeled, then faded, then gathered himself, made small by distance and by the choice to be small. The third kept near, but on a line that would bring him late to any party that mattered. Cole did a thing then that only looks like nothing if you have never needed the difference between a finish and almost. He let the stallion walk for 30 heartbeats. Not slow, true. The walk reset breath, reset back, reset the place where a right lead had begun to shorten. Then he eased to trot, then to canter, then to the businesslike lope that holds a clock in its mouth and chews without swallowing. Back toward the wire, the night had swallowed the glitter. They'd have lifted it, or the earth had, or the desert had no use for repeating the same trick twice. The brush drag lay where it had been, but the path around it was easier now, because courage is a tool that sharpens use by use. When the town lifted out of the low ground, it did not look like salvation. It looked like work, roof lines, fences, a well that needed cleaning, a street that collected yesterday until someone swept. The rusty lantern's chimney breathed. A rooster lied to itself and the rest of us. The OK Corral's black silhouette took the dawn like a blade takes a whetstone. Cole brought Shadowrunner in straight and honest. No flourish, no swagger, legs under him, head low, back warm. He let the stallion blow and angled to the same gate he'd left, the place where a bargain had stepped out of talk and into blood. Caldwell stood where he had stood, the same stripe of silence across his shoulders. Marietta had not moved far. She stood with her eyes on the horizon, like she could haul a man home with stare alone. Crow was where men like Crow always are when risk is spent, near the middle, close to the counting hand. Time makes itself loud in the last 100 yards. Hoofbeats sounded like nails being set. The stallion's breath was a bellows, forging something that would bear a name. Cole did not lift his head to the crowd until the fence rail accepted Shadowrunner's shadow back into the yard, and the horse's hooves found the old dust. He slid down without flourish and let both hands rest on the stallion's neck long enough to pay the debt he owed an animal for letting a man be larger than he deserves. Then he turned. Dawn put a pale coin on the roofline of the OK Corral and dragged it slow, like it wanted to watch a town decide what kind of place it meant to be. No one spoke first. The flats had said enough for all of us. The yard didn't erupt into applause. Dry Willow wasn't that kind of town, and Cole Haverford wasn't that kind of man. Victories out here didn't arrive with brass bands or champagne. They came quiet, heavy, and with the kind of silence that makes people shift their boots because they don't know what to do with the air between them. Shadowrunner stood blowing softly, his coat dark with sweat along the withers and chest, but his eyes were calm. Cole's hand stayed resting on the stallion's neck a moment longer, like he was telling the horse something no one else could hear. The connection between man and beast wasn't flashy. It was bone-deep trust, earned in miles, in grit, in the quiet way a rider matches his breathing to the animal under him. Marietta stepped forward, her bare feet pressing the cold dirt, her hands trembling despite the steel in her spine. She didn't rush to him. She stopped halfway, as if the distance was a test. One last measure before either of them closed it. The crowd was holding something back too. Respect in the West isn't shouted. It's measured in the way men stop smirking and tip their hats without thinking about it. Elias Crow's smirk was gone, though he tried to hide its absence behind a shrug. His eyes were two chips of wet slate, searching for a foothold in ground that had just given way beneath him. Caldwell was the first to move, stepping forward with the slow certainty of a man who's carried law in places where law is more suggestion than rule. His voice didn't need to rise. The quiet made it carry. The wager's settled. The horse and the girl are yours, Cole. No one here disputes that, do they? The pause that followed wasn't for drama. It was the pause men take when they're deciding whether to make trouble or to let the day go on. No one spoke. A cough, the creak of leather, and then the shuffle of boots stepping back, making space for a man who'd earned it. Cole's eyes didn't leave Crow's. "Say it." Crow's jaw flexed. "You heard the sheriff." "Say it." Crow's nostrils flared, the kind of flare that happens when pride is being carved from bone. "She's yours. Clean." It should have ended there. The wager was done, the terms met, the stakes paid. But in the West, endings have a way of pulling threads you didn't see until the whole cloth starts to fray. Marietta moved closer now, her eyes never leaving Cole's face. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the other half of the ash bread she'd kept. It was slightly crumbled from the ride in her dress, but she held it out to him as if it were made of silver. "For the road you've yet to ride," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes, dark and wide, carried something deeper. Gratitude, yes, but also fear. The kind of fear you feel when you've been passed from one set of hands to another too many times to believe the next one will hold you without letting go. Cole took the bread and broke it in half again, offering a piece back to her. "Then we'll finish it together." It was a small gesture, but in a place where food could be scarce and trust even scarcer, it was the kind of act people remembered. You could feel it in the way the air softened around them, in the way the men who'd come for a spectacle now shifted like they were intruding on something private. I watched Marietta's shoulders drop just enough to let the weight of the night slide off. She didn't smile, but her eyes changed, the way eyes do when they see a horizon instead of a wall. The sheriff broke the spell, turning to the crowd. "Show's over. If you've got work, see to it. If you've got nothing better to do, find something." It wasn't a request. The yard began to thin, boots dragging through dirt, voices low, the energy bleeding out into the waking town. Crow lingered, of course. Men like him don't walk away from a loss. They retreat, measuring the ground for the next fight. He stepped closer to Cole, his voice low enough that only a few of us heard it. "You ride well, but the flats don't care about who wins in town. Out there, it's still my country." Cole didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stallion shifted his weight, ears flicking back toward Crow, and somehow that was answer enough. Marietta's eyes followed Crow until he was gone. Only then did she let out a breath she'd been holding since the moment the wager was made. We stood there a while, me, Cole, Marietta, Caldwell, and the horse, letting the cold seep in now that the heat of the moment had passed. Somewhere down the street, the rusty lantern's door creaked open, and the smell of coffee drifted out, strong and bitter. Marietta turned her head slightly toward it, then back to Cole. "You hungry?" "Always," he said, and for the first time that night, there was a flicker of something like humor in his voice. We walked toward the lantern together, the kind of walk where no one's leading and no one's following, just moving in the same direction because it feels right. Shadowrunner followed without a rope, his hooves whispering against the packed dirt, head low, as if the ride had burned the fight down to a steady flame. Inside, the lantern was half lit, the oil lamps throwing warm circles on the tables. The stove in the corner radiated heat that smelled faintly of iron and old wood. The owner, a Navajo woman named Ada Graywater, looked up from behind the counter. Her eyes went from Cole to Marietta, to the horse outside, and though she didn't say a word, I could see the understanding settle in her expression. She ladled out bowls of mutton stew without being asked, setting them on the counter, along with a plate of fry bread still sizzling from the pan. The smell filled the room, meat rich with juniper and wild onion, bread crisp at the edges and soft at the heart. Marietta took the first bite like she was afraid it might vanish if she looked away. Cole ate slower, methodically, his eyes on the steam curling from the bowl. For a while, no one spoke. We just ate, the kind of eating that's less about hunger and more about proving to yourself that you've made it far enough to taste the next thing. When the bowls were empty and the bread reduced to crumbs, Cole leaned back slightly, his chair creaking. "Where do you want to go?" Marietta didn't hesitate. "Home." "And where's that?" She looked down at her hands, tracing the pattern of the weaving at her waist. "North, Canyon de Chelly. My people are there, if they'll have me." Cole nodded once, like he was weighing a map in his head. "Then north it is." There was no promise of safety in his tone, no guarantee they'd arrive without more trouble. But there was something else, commitment, the kind that doesn't have to be shouted to be real. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale, the first light spilling like water over the rooftops. The day ahead would bring questions, whispers, maybe even more challenges. But for now, in the soft heat of the lantern, the only thing that mattered was the quiet between three people who'd seen enough of the night to appreciate what it hadn't taken from them. I didn't know then how much that quiet would matter, or how long it would last. But I knew this. The ride to the mission and back had been a test of skill and grit. What lay ahead would be a test of something harder. Trust in a land where that was rarer than rain. And in that moment, with the smell of juniper stew still in the air and the sound of Shadowrunner's slow breathing just outside, I felt something I hadn't in a long time on these plains. Hope. We left Dry Willow with the first honest light, the kind that lays a pale hand on roofs and says, "Wake, there's work." The town folded behind us without ceremony. Shadowrunner took the road like he remembered being made for it. Head low, ears easy, stride turning the morning into a steady hum through bone. Cole rode bareback for the first mile to keep the stallion loose, then slid a simple hackamore over the jaw, a length of braided rawhide that asked rather than demanded. Marietta walked beside us until the ruts thinned to two clean lines, then mounted the spare bay Ada Graywater had loaned, a rangy animal with a forgiving heart and a spine you had to meet halfway. We cut north by the long route, skirting the high grass where rustlers like to drift, and following the low, hard pan where prints speak clearly. Cole chose ground like a man picking words in a room where truth could cost you. Behind us, Dry Willow sank into heat, mirage and morning, and the lane of our going settled into rhythm. Hoof on dirt, breath, leather whisper, wind. By noon, the land had changed its grammar. Cottonwood gave way to cedar. The creek beds deepened into arroyos with sides like baked bread. We angled toward the shadow line of the Chuska Mountains, their blue backs laid out like sleeping horses. The day was clean, the sky a chipped bowl, and if you didn't know better, you'd say the world meant us no harm. But the world doesn't have to mean harm to hold men who do. I saw the sign first, a notch in the dust where a shod hoof had clipped a stone, fresh, flaking, light-colored chips like fish scales. A little farther, a mesquite branch dragged and broken at a height that says, "Rider, not storm." Cole didn't look back. He didn't need to. The set of his shoulders said he'd been counting ghosts since we left the yard. We stopped at a shallow wash to water the horses. The San Juan wind pushed light down the channel, a slow knife. Marietta knelt and filled a small gourd cup, the one she kept wrapped in cloth beneath her skirt, and tilted it toward Cole first. He shook his head and put the cup to Shadowrunner's lips. The stallion took 2 good swallows and stepped aside so the bay could drink. Only when both animals had wet mouths did Cole take a mouthful himself and pass the gourd to Marietta. Mercy moves in small circles before it decides to grow. We ate with our hands, jerked beef, a heel of ash bread Marietta had saved, a pinch of roasted pignon. She held the bread like a memory and tore it in halves without looking. No one spoke for a while. The wind did the talking, sifting grit, bending small grasses, finding every seam in a man's coat and reminding him he wasn't sewn tight enough. Pursuit shows itself to those who've earned the right to notice. A raven rose and settled twice on the same snag behind us. That's a watcher's bird, drawn by the idea of disturbance. The line of our trail carried a new shadow where no cloud lived. And once, small as a lie. The wind sorted a thread of tobacco smoke into the clean blue air and unmade it before a second breath. We climbed a stony ridge where the ground changed its mind and turned to slick rock. Cold took us along the spine and then off it, dropping into a shelf of wind-scoured stone, etched with petroglyphs old as prayer. Spirals, deer with ladders for legs, a handprint that belonged to a person who still had something to say to a day none of us would see. Marietta touched the hand with 2 fingers. Her face softened, then sharpened, the way a woman's face does when the past opens and refuses to hurt her, just for a breath. We made our camp early by a stand of juniper twisted into question marks. Cole dug a trench fire, long and narrow, not for heat, but for keeping flame under the wind. Marietta brewed Navajo tea, greasewood, and wild mint, a pinch of ground sumac for tartness. Let it lean in a blackened pot until the steam smelled like relief. We ate blue corn mush, thickened with juniper ash the way her mother taught her. It kept a belly honest without taking a man's strength. Close to dusk, we heard the far-off clink of metal on stone, the careless kiss of spur to rock. It came once, then not again. That is how patience sounds in men who practice it. Dark remade the land into fewer things. Cole doused the trench to a whisper and raked sand over the glow. We pulled our bedrolls tight to the lee of a boulder that had had the good sense to land here 1,000 years ago and stay. Shadowrunner in the bay stood ground-tied, heads angled into the night's drift, ears telling more than any map. I slept with my hand on the mail sack the way a man does when all he owns can be stolen in his sleep and all he carries can burn if his luck turns. Sometime near moonset, a coyote sang a rusted hinge song and another answered, closer than you'd expect and less afraid than you'd like. The horses didn't spook. They listened and dismissed, like veterans in a town where thunder has lost its right to surprise. At first light we moved. The air smelled of iron and crushed sage. Cole took us off the obvious line and ran our trail along long sections of stone where hooves leave only the idea of going, not the proof of it. When we had to cross dirt, he doubled back in short arcs and then straightened, painting the ground with questions. I smiled despite myself. The desert is an honest ledger, but even ledgers can be made to take dictation from a man who knows where to place his commas. By mid-morning, the land opened into a wide sunk flat, where sand had settled and forgot to move. Out in the middle, the surface looked firm as a bank promise. It wasn't. I watched one splotch of darker tan shrug under wind, then breathe, a shallow puddle of earth deciding what it wanted to be. Cole reined off without comment, angling around the soft center toward a collar of cactus that had learned the difference between solid and treachery. That's when the first rider showed himself proper, coming slow from the west with the sun staged behind his shoulder, so we'd need to choose between the glare and the man. He wore his hat brim straight, not cocked, which tells you something about whether he learned his style in town, or because a town learned it from him. He did not put his hand near his gun. He didn't need to. His horse's ears did that for him, bullet straight and listening. Another rider peeled off the horizon to the east, taking the shape of a parenthesis opening. A third drifted behind like he'd been paid to be late. Men like these don't call out. They move the world closer until it touches, then argue with distance like it owes them rent. Cole let them come until the space between us tasted like pennies. He didn't speak to us or to them. He spoke to the ground with his eyes, reading the pitch of the sand and the shallow pulses of a dried-up seep that hadn't given water in years, but still remembered how. When he found the seam he wanted, he slid his weight and asked Shadowrunner for a line none of the rest of us could see until the horse rode it in. Marietta didn't turn her head. She rode with her back straight and her hands quiet, the way someone rides through a room where people are deciding whether to pretend you're invisible or not. I kept the bay where he could smell the stallion's sweat and believe in it. The riders began to fan wider to force our pace into the soft center. Cole answered by slowing. Slowness is a tell if you're scared. It's a weapon if you're not. Shadowrunner came down to a walk you could mend a life to, every step placed like a mason, with one good stone left. The surface looked trustworthy. The surface lied. 100 yards shy of the dark patch, the first rider chirped to his mount. Just a pursed-lip bird call, and the horse stepped willing as a friend into the treachery. Sand that had put on a crust to look respectable melted. The forelegs sank to the knee. The horse lurched and sucked down another hand. The rider swore once, no art, and pitched himself free. He landed on ankle-deep slurry and nearly lost his boot. The horse thrashed, eyes gone white, making the sound living things make when the world quits holding. Cole was already off Shadowrunner before the second flail. He moved with the absence of drama a good man brings to a bad moment. He uncoiled the rawhide line from the saddle horn he hadn't used all morning, tied a war knot that would release clean under load, and kept his voice as level as a horizon. He didn't look at the man. He looked at the horse. Mercy knows the order of things. He made a loop around the stuck animal's chest, high and tight to keep lungs clear, then took 2 running steps back to Shadowrunner, who had planted himself at a triangle of ground firm enough to take an argument. Cole set the line low and asked for tension. The stallion rocked back like a Roman plow and pulled. Sand protested. Tendon sang. The trapped horse came up a hand, slid an inch, came up another, and lurched forward with a sucking roar. The rider scrambled crabwise to the collar of solid ground and fell to his knees, hat gone, hair pasted with grit. He looked at Cole with a face that couldn't afford gratitude, not in front of men he'd be men with later, and in that look you could read the cost of being beholden. Cole didn't wait for a thank you. He coiled his line, checked Shadowrunner's eye, and turned north. Marietta's breath eased out like someone had loosened a high cinch. We put the soft ground behind us and climbed onto wind-planed stone, where lichen made maps no one but the stone could read. The riders lived on our edges a while longer, smaller now, with less to say. Men who come to end you do not like being saved by you first. It shortens their arguments. We skirted a low Hogan settlement near midday. Smoke braided up through a roof hole, clean and blue. An old woman stood in the doorway with a wool card in one hand and the present tense in the other. Marietta lifted a palm in greeting that bent like a willow branch. The woman nodded once. Words weren't required. The land spoke both ways and translated without charge. By late afternoon, we rode under sandstone cliffs that had stored 1,000 sunsets and still kept room for ours. Ravens tacked from ledge to ledge like bits of fallen night looking for a place to land. Marietta began humming under her breath, a song with no edges, only circles. It sounded like a pot cooling, like kettle steam finding the part of a house where it won't do harm. Shadowrunner twitched an ear to it and lengthened a half stride. We camped in the lee of a broken wall, where handprints, red as coals, dotted the stone, the living always trying to talk to the living through the future. Cole built another trench and fed it slow. The bay slept with a hind leg cocked. Shadowrunner dozed, but never surrendered both ears. I wrote a note to a miner's wife, back in Dry Willow, who'd asked me 3 times if his letters were still coming. I told the paper they were, because sometimes the truth a person needs is a bridge you build quick so they can get across this day. I tucked the note where it would not be found until it needed to. Near moonrise, a cold front shouldered into us, grained with ice like ground glass. We pulled blankets tight and let the desert announce winter's intention. When dawn came, it came brittle and full of mirrors. We broke camp with fingers that didn't argue and horses that did, a little because honest animals don't pretend. By mid-morning, Window Rock took the horizon, the great arch cut into stone like a gate a giant misplaced. We crossed its shadow and did not speak. Some places are churches, whether men decide to name them or not. Marietta looked older there, and younger both. She touched her belt weaving and breathed a word that stayed hers. Tracks renewed behind us. 2 sets, not 3. Men had made their choice, less show, more reach. Cole shifted our path off the most direct line and ran us along a seam of slick rock that tilted toward the east. He knew what rain does on stone and how it tells its own story days after the cloud that wrote it is gone. The ambush came cheap and quick, 2 shots from a cut between boulders, not to hit but to measure our nerve. The first cracked high over Shadowrunner's pole and stitched a blue line into the sky. The second struck a slab and spit chips with teeth. Cole didn't duck. He didn't draw. He slid his weight and rolled the stallion behind a tooth of rock where the bay could tuck in and I could fold the mail sack under my ribs and pretend fate prefers tidy handwriting. Silence took back the space it had rented to noise. When nothing else came, Cole rolled out, not to fight, but to finish the distance between scents and the next shelter. He put Shadowrunner's feet into a ladder of stone steps, and the stallion took them like a confession. Honest, measured, no hurry. The bay followed, every hoof set where it could be forgiven if it slipped. Marietta's face had gone pale with anger, not fear. Fear takes away. Anger offers. She pulled a small medicine pouch from beneath her collar and blew softly into it, then tied it to the hackamore cheek of Shadowrunner, like giving a name to a storm you expect to outlast. We topped the rise and saw the world open toward Chinle and Canyon de Chelly. Great red throats of stone unbuttoned to the sky. Cottonwood threading green along the dry wash like stubborn veins. The distance wasn't done with us, not by a long sight, but it had shown us where it meant to be beautiful and where it meant to be cruel. That honesty was a mercy of its own. On the gentler slope down, Cole finally spoke, voice dry as a whetstone and twice as steady. Trail don't lie, but it don't always tell the truth you want. He said it to the air, or to the horse, or maybe to the part of himself that had been listening for years and was finally ready to agree. We cut sign again near midday, a drop of blood the size of a pinhead on pale sand, where a man had hurried and forgot the desert tax's movement. One of our shadows had bungled a scramble. Mercy doesn't always wear your face, but it often asks your hands. We found him soon after under a ledge that backed out of the wind. He wasn't the one saved from the sink, but he wore the same cut of hat and a cheaper version of the same pride. His ankle had folded under him sideways, and his horse had taken the opportunity to vote no with its whole body. The animal stood 30 yards off, tail flicking flies that weren't there, eye watching us with the bored interest of a creature accustomed to men ruining perfectly good days. The rider paled when he saw Cole. The hand he put near his pistol trembled a little. Not from fear, he had enough meanness to carry him through fear, but from the angry recognition that he would owe a man he meant to wrong. Cole did not step closer. He set his hat back on his head and watched the horizon for a beat, measuring the weather and the hour, then measured the inside weather and the deeper hour. He took the rawhide line again and the gentler tone men reserve for skittish things that break easy. We set the ankle straighter with a split limb and a strip torn from my mail sack canvas that would make the woman in Dry Willow wait a week longer for an answer that had already been true for months. We left him water and a heel of bread and pointed his horse toward him. Mercy isn't always about saving. Sometimes it's about giving a man the chance to choose himself better. As we backed away, Marietta stood above him long enough to let him see her seeing him. That's a gift and a judgment in one. The day wore on us without asking permission. By late light, the wind had found a new grammar, consonants of grit and vowels of cold. We put our camp among cottonwoods that had made their peace with erosion by leaning into it. Marietta sang again, but this time it was a mother song, round and low, meant to teach small things how to sleep. I thought of letters and names and the long road between them. I thought of Dry Willow and the rusted piano, and the way men lean in when a woman tells the truth softly. I thought of Crow and the shape of trouble he travels in, thin, bright, patient. Cole sat with his back to a tree and sharpened a small knife he rarely used. You can tell a man's intention by the care he gives to tools he doesn't plan to need. When the edge was true enough to split hair, he put the blade away and rested his hands on his knees, like a prayer that didn't require an answer. Night came complete and old. Stars crushed the black into a dome so full it felt like it might spill. The fire made a red coin of light and taught the dark to respect boundaries. The horses shifted, huffed, settled, the way creatures do who trust the distance between danger and sleep because someone has paid for it with sweat. Sometime after the fire learned our names, Cole spoke again, words spare as a cartridge's. I ain't looking for trouble, but I don't ride away from it either. He wasn't bragging, he was counting. No one replied. Some truths are offered to air and ember, not to ears. Marietta leaned closer to the heat and let her eyes close, lashes ash dark against skin that had learned sun the hard way. The medicine pouch on Shadowrunner's cheek stirred in a breath of wind so small it barely qualified, and yet the stallion flicked an ear to catch it. I lay down behind the low of the fire and let the ground teach my bones its old language. Tomorrow would bring Canyon de Chelly closer. Tomorrow would bring the men behind us closer, too. Between those two movements, we would have to decide whether to give the day our fear or our patience. Mercy would need room. So would grief. So would the sort of courage that doesn't swagger, the kind that keeps a pace, keeps a promise, keeps watch. Somewhere out beyond the riverbed's shallow rattle, a nighthawk stitched the dark with needlewing and was gone. The desert turned a page. We lay there, 3 people and 2 horses and a small fire, and listened as if the next line might finally be written in our favor. Morning came soft and blue, the kind of light that forgives dust and makes every scar look like a story instead of a wound. We rode toward the stone mouths of Canyon de Chelly, where walls the color of rusted sunrise rose clean out of the earth and braided the sky with their own weather. Cottonwoods stitched green along the wash. Ravens moved like punctuation above us, bold enough to correct a man mid-sentence. Marietta didn't say she was home. She didn't have to. The way her shoulders settled and the fine tremor left her hand said it plain. We took a slanting path down a slick rock ramp where hoofprints from other years lingered like old advice. Shadowrunner felt the change before the rest of us, ears forward, stride lengthening, that sweet stubborn pride a good horse keeps for the places that make sense to him. The bay tucked in behind, grateful for someone else to make the line. I kept my breath even and let the canyon do the talking, wind over stone, a hush that wasn't silence so much as listening. We found the first hogan near a bend, where the wash widened and the sand was clean as a swept floor. Smoke threaded straight up from a roof hole, and then took a right the way the wind told it to. A woman stepped out, older than either day or night wanted to claim, wool cards in her hands, and the steady gaze of someone who has seen more departures than arrivals. Her eyes touched Marietta and did not hurry away. It felt like a door opening. No one rushed. There is a right speed for re-entering your own life. A girl appeared with water in a gourd ladle, then a boy with a bundle of sumac twigs. 2 dogs announced us and then decided against a fuss. When the older woman spoke, it was to Marietta first, then to the horses. Words I did not have the right to hold settled into the space between them and fit there. The woman's name, when it came, was Adazine 2 Rivers. Kin by blood and by stubbornness, both carried neat in the same frame. She touched Marietta's cheek with the back of her fingers and let her hand fall without clutching. Joy arrived quiet and did not apologize for itself. We were brought inside and given what mattered: warmth, a place to sit, tea steeped with greasewood and wild mint, the thin curl of juniper smoke that makes a room feel held. Kneel-down bread came next, baked against hot stones, broken by the one who set it down and shared from the center outward. Laughter tried itself shyly, like a colt testing its legs. First at the way Shadowrunner had parked his head through the door flap to watch us, then at the way the boy pretended not to sneak him a pinch of bread, and the stallion pretended not to notice. Soft things grew, the slackening of Marietta's jaw, a brightness in Adazine's eyes that had not visited in a season, the little sounds a room makes when it begins to remember it is allowed to be happy. But joy, in this country, travels with its shadow. When we stepped back into the day, the canyon made a second sound underneath the first. A rhythm you can miss if your heart hasn't been taught patience. It was not the wind. It was distance finding its feet, a far-off shiver of iron on stone, a click where no bird lived. Pursuit, polite at first, knocking on the rim like a guest deciding whether the house is worth the trouble. Adazine saw it ride the air the same moment Cole did. She did not waste fear on it. She sent the children to fetch water, sent the dogs to the far side of the yard, and laid her hand once on Marietta's shoulder. There are gestures that say, "I lost you once, and now you're here, and I will not spend the afternoon arguing with trouble about the rightness of that." Cole's eyes went up canyon, toward a shelf of rock shaped like a folded blanket. He read a plan there and kept it to himself until the place had agreed to it. When he spoke, it was for all of us but aimed at the horses. "We make the groundwork," he said, and Shadowrunner's ears flicked their yes. We moved camp into the canyon's ribs, a natural corral cut by ancestors who had heard the same trouble 1,000 nights and built with it in mind. Adazine and the children carried coals in a clay bowl like they were walking prayer across the yard. Marietta shouldered water and rolled blankets, her strength clean and unarguable as a braided rope. I hauled my smallness in the only way I know, carried what would be needed, and laid it where a hand would find it without asking. That was the hour the past found its voice. Not in words, not at first, but in a box Adazine kept beneath a flat stone. She opened it and lifted a strip of weaving, red and black and white, a pattern like river talk. It had been Marietta's mother's, worn thin at the edges by hands that had worked, softened in the center where a child might have pressed a face. Adazine folded it around Marietta's waist with a care that said both blessing and reminder, then set a pinch of corn pollen along her hairline and across Cole's palms. The gesture was quiet as a leaf landing and twice as sure. We made a meal that tasted like both beginning and repair. Sheep stew thick with wild onion, blue corn mush you could stand a spoon in, strips of dried squash that remembered summer. The children brought a clay drum and tapped out a heartbeat, neither rushed nor dragged. An uncle I had not seen arrive hummed low and steady, a song with room inside it. Grief lifted a corner of the room and looked in. Joy tugged it back down with 2 fingers and told it to sit. For a time, we had both and were greedy for neither. When the first rider showed himself on the rim, there was a ridiculous burst of gladness in me I have never been able to account for. Gladness that the problem had decided to wear a face I could dislike instead of a shape I had to imagine. He was careful this time. No bravado, no theatrics. Just a silhouette against the rim's bright edge, hat brim a straight line, the horse under, him standing like a well-made chair. He didn't call. He didn't have to. The voice of a gunshot doesn't require rehearsal. We did not raise rifles. Caldwell was back in Dry Willow, but his sort of law had traveled. No one would fire first. The canyon had its own justice besides, the kind that punishes foolish angles and rewards patience with echoes. Cole checked the wind with his face, said nothing, and set the horses where the ground would favor us. Shadowrunner tucked under a lip with room to spring, the bay against a boulder that would eat a bad shot for breakfast. 2 more riders posted themselves like commas in a sentence that meant to run on. Below them, a man on foot took the long way down the goat trail, picking his steps like he was paying interest on a debt he'd talked himself into. When he came into the yard, he brought a limp and a hat that had seen better arguments. He was the ankle we'd splinted yesterday, or the day before, or 10 years. Time blurs when duty and mercy cross trails. He put his hand up, not high, just enough, and it occurred to me he was offering to be smaller than his habit. "Message," he said to me first, and then to the space around Cole's silence. "Crow rides with papers from a judge who drinks with him. He means to lay claim to the wash for grazing rights and water. Says the treaty words say what he says they say." Adazine didn't blink. Words bend when men are thirsty for the wrong things. The man swallowed. He took something from his coat, not the papers, not yet, but a folded parcel crude as honesty. A strip of salt pork, 2 cartridges wrapped in oiled rag, a lucky coin holed for a string. He placed them on a flat stone like a poor altar. "For the pullin'," he said, voice almost clear. "For the food. For not letting me sink into the kind of lie a man dies from." He looked at Marietta and found the thing in himself he'd started out with, before he'd learned meanness. His mouth opened like a door, then shut the way a man does when he discovers he doesn't have the right words for a room. He went back the way he'd come, slow and true. No one hurried him. The canyon allowed his smallness without mocking it. Above, the rim riders shifted weight and pretended they'd never had ankles to break. What happened next felt like 2 days layered. A bright day where children chased a puppy around a goat, and a darker day where the wind found the taste of metal and made a note of it. We mended a halter and brushed dust from a saddle that hadn't earned it, and watched the light crawl a seam down the wall like a gold knife learning restraint. We taught the youngest boy not to run at the horses, and the horses not to step on his joy. We laughed when Shadow Runner took a mouthful of kneel-down bread and then pretended he hadn't. When Marietta told the children where the canyon sings back to you if you sing properly to it, I watched Cole's face go softer than a man who lives by angles usually allows. Then Crow came, all of him at once, as if the canyon had decided to be done with suspense. He rode into the mouth without a sound wasted. 4 men with him, none of them boys. He had a leather folder in his hand, the kind papers like to hide behind. If the canyon scared him, he left the fear with his other admirers. He looked at Adazine first and found no purchase there. He looked at Marietta and tried a smile he could charge interest on. He looked at Cole and found a billing address for an old grudge. When his eyes found me, they slid off and went to the horse. Most men's eyes do. He announced his rights as if a sentence delivered in the right tone becomes a fact. By authority of... He named names I did not respect, and places I had never been willing to trust. The papers came out, stiff, confident, oily as new boots. He held them flat with a palm like a promise. Cole didn't take them. Adazine didn't look. Marietta set a bowl on the stone step and, without hurry, covered it with a cloth to keep flies off what was sweet. When she spoke, her voice was not for Crow. "Our water remembers us," she said. "Yours remembers your face." Crow smiled the way a man smiles when he doesn't recognize the room he is standing in and blames the furniture. He signaled with 2 fingers. One of his men nudged his horse forward, 3 steps into the yard, and found the earth there held a different opinion about hooves than it had yesterday. We had watered the ground just enough to convince the top to lie. The gelding's front feet punched through the crust. That horse recovered before anyone could be cruel about it, and backed out with dignity. The rider's dignity took longer and made a worse show of it. Crow's gaze sharpened. Tenderness and cunning have always shared a fence line. He backed his horse 2 lengths and addressed the air. "I don't want blood. I want paper respected." Cole didn't move. The canyon moved for him. Wind running a rope over a far wall. Ravens shaving black coins from the sky. He finally spoke like a man, listing what cannot be traded. "You don't want blood," he said, "because you think you'll be the one who bleeds if it starts." Crow laughed, but not because he was happy. "You've earned a name, Haverford. The flats gave it, I'll grant you. But names fade when the ink dries, and men who can read gather at a table." Then Adazine stepped forward, the way stone steps forward when water tries to argue with it. She lifted a small bag from her belt and touched the rim of the leather folder with corn pollen. Once, twice. The way a mother blesses a child she doesn't trust to do as he's told. "Your paper is a hungry mouth," she said. "It will eat and not be full. Our walls have eaten wind longer than your words have had teeth." Crow wiped the pollen away with the back of his hand, not roughly, but with a kind of offense I recognized from churches, when someone loves the building more than the prayer. He took a breath that wanted to become a command, and swallowed it until it looked like patience. "I'll give you an hour," he said. "Then I take the wash." He backed his horse out neat and proper, because even bad men respect a yard that knows itself. The others followed, their faces trying to learn nothing. When they turned the bend, the canyon stitched the sound up with thread, it had been saving for just such foolishness. We did not waste the hour. The canyon is a machine you can wind if you pay attention. Cole put Shadowrunner in the bay, where Stone would pinch sound and send it back heavier than it went out. Adazine moved the children and the old ones deeper into the shade and set water near mouths that would not ask. Marietta gathered a length of woven rope and a blanketed frame. Not a weapon exactly, but a way to turn a narrow into a gate that only friends walk through. We did not build a war. We built a refusal. They came back cautious, expecting a story that would make them heroes in someone else's version of the day. Crow posted 2 at the rim with rifles and brought 2 into the yard at a walk that promised dignity and looked like fear if you knew how to translate. He tried the paper again, as if repetition was a kind of law. When the demand hit the stones and came back uglier, I felt the canyon choose sides with the oldest kind of math. Cole raised his hand shoulder high, palm out. Not a threat, not surrender. A sign to the horse that the next movement would be a turn. Shadowrunner lifted onto his hocks, that gravity-defying coil a trained horse keeps under skin, and the yard felt the ground decide whose weight it favored. Cole spoke, but not to Crow. He spoke to the canyon, to the horse, to the promise he'd made to cross and recross a night without losing himself. Easy, on the touch. We moved without spectacle. The horses stepped as if the air itself were braided and would hold. The woven frame came up like a fence that had always been there. The water Adazin had laid down glinted like a lie begging to be believed. Crow's lead horse tried it and found his feet can't argue with physics. A rifle cracked from the rim. High, warning, the sound of a man trying to stay relevant. The echo returned from 4 walls and made it sound like a poor chorus rehearsing a worse song. No one bled. Crow's face changed, not into a better man, but into the man he is when a mirror has no reasons left to be kind. He measured the wash in the walls and the hour he had promised and found himself short in all 3. His hand crept toward a handgun, then stopped on the hinge. The canyon watched him the way a grown village watches a boy with matches. He reined his horse half a step, parting his mouth for a last try. Marietta spoke first, and what she said was not about paper or about pride. "You said I chose you," she said, voice level as water that knows its bed. "You forgot to say you chose the girl who hadn't eaten. I am not that girl now. There is food in me. There is song. There is a man who listens and a horse that remembers the way home. You can leave now with what you brought, or you can leave with less." Something in that took the starch out of the hour. Crow blinked once like a man encountering weather he cannot put his hand through. He didn't have the materials for winning, only the habit of trying. That is a thin blanket under a cold sky. He lowered his hand from his gun. He nodded at the rim. The rifles there went away the way dust goes when you stop needing it to prove anything. He had one parting shape to throw, a promise that wouldn't hold water in daylight. "This isn't finished," he said. Cole answered without anger. "It is for today." They rode out, smaller than they'd come in, the canyon eating their sound until it became something you could sprinkle on the ground and grow beans with. The boy who had fed Shadowrunner a scrap of bread laughed, not at them, but at the puppy, who had tripped over his own paws and decided to act like he meant it. That laughter is what I will remember if I am allowed one memory and have to waste it carefully. The hour after was stitched from contrasts so close together you could use them for thread. Adazine unclasped her hands only when the last hoofprint blew soft at the bend. Then she put those same hands to work, ladling stew, breaking bread, laying a palm on the cheek of the horse who had not embarrassed us. Marietta sat in the doorway with the children, and told them how a canyon can teach you to be tall without leaving the ground. The bay dozed with his lip drooping. Shadowrunner planted a hind leg and pretended he had never once in his life considered throwing a man into the sun. And then, because the world has a sense of humor that leans tender as often as it leans cruel, rain came. Not a storm. A kindness. A seam out over the rim that threaded itself down the wall and stitched the dust shut. One silver line at a time. The children ran their fingers under it and tasted iron. Adazine set a clay pot where the fall fattened and smiled like a secret had remembered her properly. Cole took his hat off, not to worship the water, but to let it find the old sweat in the band and carry some of it away. We worked, then rested, then worked again, patching a pen, tightening a lash, mending a girth where age had weakened what habit had not. I wrote a letter I will never send to a woman who had asked me to bring her husband home with ink, and I told her about a canyon that refuses men with small ideas. I folded that letter into my pocket and walked it out under the rain until the paper decided to forget me and join whatever book the weather keeps. Close to dusk, Adazine brought out a blanket she had been weaving for a year and made of it what a day like this deserved, a gift that does not ask to be forgiven for its beauty. She set it over Marietta's shoulders and let the fringe name each thing we had chosen rightly. The horse's breath, the man's patience, the hour that didn't spill blood, the laughter that built a bridge across a hard morning. Cole looked away because that kind of tenderness asks a man to look away if he wants to keep his shape. We ate again because joy eats and grief doesn't know what to do with dishes. There was a sweetness in the stew I hadn't tasted earlier. Marietta told me Adazine had the nerve to put a pinch of dried peach in a pot meant for meat, and we all agreed it was a good crime. The drum came back, low, then higher, then low again, and voices braided around it, not ceremony and not performance, just a room deciding together to be alive. I have sat in 100 rooms and carried them away in my coat, but that evening was one that put a coat on me and sent me out better dressed. Night arrived complete. Stars jammed themselves into every inch of black. The rim, which had held men that morning, now held only cold and the memory of small choices. The horses breathed in the slow way of animals who have been allowed to keep their portion of the day. Cole set his bedroll a little outside the circle and put his hat over his eyes, the way a man lowers a curtain. Marietta lay with the blanket up to her chin and her face turned toward the fire, where shadows made a gentle map of the person she had decided again to be. Adazine's hands, finally idle, looked like tools that had earned sleep. There was sorrow in the yard, sorrow for the girl who had once stood outside a theater in Tombstone and traded hunger for the wrong kind of shelter. Sorrow for the men who ride away from kindness because they don't know where to put it. Sorrow for all the letters I have carried late or not at all. But sorrow shared a plate with other guests. A stubborn gladness, a humble pride, a humor that didn't need permission. Joy did not conquer grief. They sat down together and ate a meal that had been waiting to be cooked. I took first watch out of habit, and because a man who has spent years listening tonight feels lonely without its company. The rain finished its sentence and left the ground damp as bread just out of the oven. A fox the size of a thought trotted by and nodded like we lived here too. Somewhere high, a nighthawk stitched the dark with a loose thread. The canyon put a hand on my shoulder and said nothing, which I have come to understand is its way of telling you it approves. Near midnight, I woke Cole with a toe to his boot and a whisper that felt like lint in the big room of that quiet. He propped himself on an elbow and listened to the nothing as if it might confess. It didn't. He settled back, and after a time he said, "Not to me. We'll build a rail in the morning." It was an odd thing to call a vow, but it was the right shape, small, fixable, forward. Dawn threatened from far off and thought better of it for a while. When it finally came, it came with that particular kindness you only see after a day that has asked a lot and been answered correctly. The children woke first with that snort laugh kids do when sleep refuses to leave without one last joke. Adazin checked the pot with 2 fingers and made a sound like satisfaction. Marietta stepped out of the hogan and looked up at the walls the way a person checks a mirror after long absence and finds the face better than memory. Cole had his hat on and his hands already in the day. Shadowrunner bumped his shoulder once with the soft of his nose and pretended he hadn't. There was work ahead, a rail to set, a trough to seal, a route to scout for those who would come bringing paper instead of water. There would be more riders someday, and maybe a judge sober enough to make trouble behave. There would be an hour when laughter would not arrive on time, and another when it would get there early and bring a friend. None of it felt easy, and none of it felt impossible. The canyon kept our echoes and gave us back our size. No bigger than we deserved, no smaller than we needed to be. And in that rightness, in that patient blend of joy and ache, the day drew a breath I swear I could hear, and we began again. The morning broke like a man easing into a chair he meant to stay in, slow, deliberate, and with a sigh that took the weight off his bones. The canyon walls glowed with the kind of gold you only see after rain, when stone remembers it can shine without the sun burning it raw. The air was soft, almost heavy, with the scent of wet earth and juniper, the kind of air that slows your hands because there's no need to rush. Even the ravens seemed to speak lower, as if they didn't want to break whatever peace had settled here in the night. Cole was already up, boots planted in damp sand, running a hand along Shadowrunner's neck. The stallion leaned into it with the quiet confidence of an animal who knows his part in the story has been told and told well. The bay stood nearby, chewing a strand of hay like it was a secret he planned to keep. Marietta came from the hogan with her hair loose, the blanket Adazine had given her draped around her shoulders. She moved slower than I'd seen her since Dry Willow. Not from fatigue, but from something else. The kind of slowing that happens when a body finally understands it's safe, even if only for now. She crossed the yard barefoot, her steps silent on the damp earth, and handed Cole a cup of tea steeped dark and hot. Adazine was at the fire, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon, worn thin from years of use. The smell of blue corn porridge drifted through the morning, rich, earthy, laced with the faint tang of juniper ash. She had added dried peach again. I could tell from the way the sweetness lingered in the air, warming the edges of the day. The children were chasing each other in slow arcs, their laughter light and unhurried, their voices folding into the canyon's echoes. It was the kind of sound you could fall asleep to, the kind that curls up in the edges of your memory and stays there long after the dust has been washed from your boots. We ate together without much talk, the kind of meal where words would have been too heavy and too sharp for the moment. Cole finished first, wiped the edge of the wooden bowl with his thumb, and set it down carefully, like he was putting away more than just breakfast. "Rails," he said quietly, almost to himself, but Adazine heard. She nodded once and handed him a coil of rope. They didn't need to say more. The work would get done, the water kept safe, the yard kept whole. I sat with my back to a sun-warmed rock, letting the heat sink through my coat, watching the way the day opened up without hurry. There was no trace of Crow or his men, no fresh hoofprints on the rim. The canyon had decided to keep its quiet, at least for now. Marietta sat beside me, her knees drawn up, the blanket gathered close. Her eyes were on the walls, tracing the shadows and ledges like she was memorizing them. "You ever think about where you'd settle?" she asked. "If you didn't have to move anymore?" "Every mile," I said. She nodded, not surprised. I think I'd stay where the walls are tall enough to keep your voice in, and the wind gentle enough to carry it to the right ears. We stayed there, letting the day slip around us. Cole and Adazine worked on the rail for the wash, setting posts deep and firm, tamping the earth in silence. Every now and then, one of the children would bring them water, and Cole would crouch low to take it, like the act itself was something sacred. By midday, the work was done. The posts stood straight, the rope taut, the wash defended. The sun had moved high enough to heat the rock underfoot, and the smell of the morning rain had thinned, replaced by the sharper scent of warm cedar and dust. Adazin brought out the last of the kneel-down bread and a jar of wild honey. We ate in the shade, dipping the bread in honey, the sweetness slow on the tongue. It was the kind of food that lingers in your mouth, the way a good story lingers in your mind. Long after the details fade, you still taste the truth of it. Cole leaned back against the wall, his hat tilted low, one leg stretched out. Marietta lay on her side in the patch of shade beside him, the blanket tucked under her chin. Shadowrunner dozed with his nose resting on the top rail of the new fence, his breathing steady and slow. The canyon had a way of pulling the tension out of your shoulders without asking permission. It wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, it just reminded you that not every sound is a warning, not every shadow is a threat. The air was thick with a kind of safety that's rare in the West, the kind you don't trust right away because it feels too much like a dream. We stayed in that stillness until the sun slipped lower, painting the walls in amber and rose. Adazin gathered the children inside, her voice soft as the breeze that curled through the yard. Cole and Marietta sat close without touching, their shoulders almost brushing, their eyes on the shifting colors. I sat a little apart, not because I was unwelcome, but because some moments belong to the people inside them. As the light faded, the canyon filled with that blue that makes you think of deep water. Shadows stretched long, and the first stars began to prick the sky. Adazine lit a small fire, the flames licking at the cool air. We ate a light supper, stew left from the night before, bread and tea that smelled faintly of mint. When the bowls were cleaned and the fire settled into a bed of coals, we sat together in the circle of its glow. Cole broke the silence first, his voice low, carrying the weight of miles behind it. "You ride long enough," he said. "You learn the trail's not just dirt and rock. It's people. Some stay, some go, and you carry 'em either way." No one answered right away. The fire popped once, sending a small flare into the dark before it faded. Marietta pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned just slightly toward the heat. The canyon seemed to listen with us, the walls holding, the quiet steady. The stars were sharp now, the sky clear enough to make you believe you could ride straight into it. Adazine looked into the fire, her face soft in the light, and said, "We can't choose all the storms that come, but we can choose who we stand beside when they do." It was the kind of truth that didn't need to be debated, the kind you could carry in your pocket and take out years later, still finding it fit your hand. The coals glowed steady, their light flickering against the walls. Shadowrunner shifted in his sleep, the bay answered with a soft snort, and the world outside the canyon felt far away, like it belonged to someone else. The night settled around us with a warmth that wasn't from the fire alone. It was the warmth of being in a place that had decided, at least for now, to hold you without asking for payment. The kind of place where you could close your eyes without wondering what you'd wake to. One by one, we stretched out our bedrolls, the fire's glow soft on our faces. Marietta lay close to the embers, her breathing already deepening. Cole lay just beyond her, his hat over his eyes, one hand resting on the ground beside him. Adazine stayed sitting a while longer, watching the flames, before she too lay down. The canyon walls rose around us, high and steady, keeping the night's edges far away. The stars turned slowly overhead, their light spilling into the canyon like a promise. The last thing I remember before sleep took me was the sound of the wind threading through the cottonwoods, low and even, like a song meant only for those inside its reach. 3 life messages from the trail. Not every fight needs to be won with force. Sometimes the strongest stand you can take is the one where you refuse to be moved, not by rage, but by resolve. Strength isn't in how loud you speak, but in how long you can hold your ground without losing yourself. Carry people the way you carry water, carefully and with purpose. On the trail and in life, some will walk beside you for miles, some for moments. But each leaves a mark in the dust, and it's worth remembering the shape of their steps. Find a place or a person that lets you rest without keeping watch. The West teaches you to always be ready, but peace, real peace, is knowing there's a night you can sleep through without one hand on your gun and the other on your pack. This was the kind of night that makes the road ahead easier to ride. Not because it will be shorter or smoother, but because you've been reminded what it feels like to belong, even if only for a while. And with that reminder warming you from the inside, you can close your eyes, let the stars keep watch, and drift into a sleep deep enough to carry you anywhere.